All right, so what we need to think about is, even though we can block things in now, how do I keep things in proportion? How do I keep them in kind of really perspective within the object itself? Because this is kind of a fat edge here. You guys can see that, a little bit skinny over here. It's not, my lines aren't correct. It feels 3D, but it's not a 3D object anyone would ever want to hold. It would feel wonky. Whereas this, I mean, this is even Steven, man. Those are perfectly straight lines. It's solid, you know. This is a pill bottle. This is obviously a drawing of a pill bottle. So we have to talk about how to fix this problem. There are two good things that artists use all the time. Again, some things that we've already talked about before, some things that we haven't. Two good things that artists use all the time to correct this problem. So, let's say, for example, I'll grab something complicated, just for the sake. There we go. This is my hand sanitizer stuff. Okay. Let's say I want to draw this. Okay, this is a pretty complicated object, right? But I know how to block it in, so I know that this right here is a cylinder. I know that there's another cylinder on the inside here, another one right there, even another one here. This would be kind of a rectangle that I would then kind of bend. This would be built out of a rectangle with these kind of edges. You can see kind of shaved off, almost like a little beveled edge. Okay? So I know, I comprehend how to make this, but how the heck do I actually do it, right? And how do I make sure that it's nice and even? I mean, this is manufactured. It is, a machine makes this, you know, it's not made by hand. So, what we need to think about is a couple things. A, think about the center line, kind of the center mass going through this object, right? Anytime you're drawing something, especially something like this where it's machine made, it's going to be duplicated, symmetrical, right? I can start just by drawing a line, literally. That's it. That's going to be kind of my middle line. So I know everything on one side is the same as the other. They are symmetrical. Now eventually you can get asymmetrical with like the nozzle over here, but you get the generalized idea. Now I'm going to start off with kind of the basics here. I'll get a better angle. Start off with kind of the basics. So, start by, and you don't have to do this one, I'm just going to show you real quick. Start by kind of following kind of the basic cube. Right? And I can kind of tell, okay, that looks pretty even. So notice before I even went to the form, the three-dimensional form, I started off with the 2D form, right, the 2D shape. I then go through and kind of block it in again. Okay, the neck is going to be about yay big, like so. The nozzle kind of comes up right there, like so. Comes up again. There's a rectangle over here. Something like that. Okay? Now again, this is incredibly basic. You would never turn this in. But, let's be honest. Well, you might, you're right. But let's be honest, if I held that, and this, right, if I had these three objects, oops. If I had these three objects before you, you'd be able to tell me which one of those three is this guy, right? Just by the basic shapes, right? Basic shapes. So, what we need to do is take into account the basic shape first. Use this plumb line here to kind of make sure, before I ever do my form, make sure everything is neat and tidy, okay? So it's kind of like if blocking in is your skeletal structure, if blocking in is kind of your foundation, this is digging the foundation, right? This is making sure everything gets where it needs to get first. Then I go through, and now I start bringing this 2D form up into the world. So now I can go through and say, okay, if it's sitting here, I'm looking at this object, take into account perspective. Maybe it's going to go back into space this way with kind of that block. Like so. This becomes kind of an oval. Right? Kind of push everything back a little bit. Push. Something like that, right? So from that very basic 2D shape, I added my concept, my knowledge of blocking in, my knowledge of form, and now I have this. Again, still by no means perfect, but you can see how it obviously goes from one to the other, right? Make sense? Make sense? And yeah, cool. All right. So then from there, I would obviously go through and start adding in more and more detail, right? Again, there's this kind of beveled edge right here. It's got a little bit of an angle on it, right? So to do that, I would just kind of think about, okay, I could cut in a little bit, like so. And I'm going to go really hard with it. I'll soften it later. Make as many lines as you need to. Who cares? You can erase it all later. Notice that there's a little bit of a arch right here. It's not straight across. A little bit of arch, and then there's this little tiny plastic lip right here before it hits this plastic cap. So again, I'm going to think about that too. I have to drop down and say, okay, maybe that's where the top is. Kind of bring it up from there. Right? Bring this down. Like so. As you're blocking in, you can also start to take into account and start to think about some textures, right? Now, before we get into color, before we get into a lot of deep textures, which we'll talk more about later on, but you know, I can start thinking about the basic stuff. I know that this little cap right here has some kind of grippies on it. So maybe mine, I go through and do these kind of little lines here to kind of simulate those grippers. I know there's a little bit of a spiral here for like a screw top. So I can kind of think about that as well. Something like that. You get the idea. But at this point, you guys, I'm not saying that it wouldn't take you a while. By all means, it's going to take you a while. But at this point, we should at least all comprehend this concept, right? Slowly blocking in, slowly kind of cutting off pieces. Now that you're thinking about making things symmetrical with this kind of plumb line, something else you can do, because I've already purposely messed up over here, something else you can do is notice this. Look how tall this cap is right here. And that is tall. And on mine, it is super squat. I mean, it's like the difference between these two caps. Pretty significant difference going on. So this is by no means photorealistic. It's messed up, right? It's not correct. I've got the plumb line down here, and that's telling me that things are symmetrical, but it's not helping me vertically, right? For that, what we can do is a thing called comparative measurement. We talked about it in Art 1. Comparative measurement is whenever you see artists kind of hold their pencil like this, and they kind of squint, stick their tongue out a little bit, they kind of like that, right? What they're doing is basically measuring using their pencil, right? So I'll show you to the best that I can here, all right? So let's say I'm looking at this object, right? I'm going to comparatively measure. So I'm going to say, okay, so on this object, I won't touch it. On this object, I'm going to go from the edge of the bottle, right about there, say, okay, this bottle is this long, right where my thumb is, right? Make sense? Then I'm going to go through and say, well, okay, so if I go 1 and 2, it's almost just a little bit more. It's maybe 2 and a bit as it is wide. So if I know how wide mine is over here, let's say from here to here, I should be able to take my measurement, move my thumb in a little bit like that. I should be able to say 1, whoops, like that, and 2 and a bit, which mine is. So height-wise, mine's okay. Height-wise, or width-wise, excuse me. So now you can go through and you can start doing that again with other aspects of this piece. So, for example, if I know how wide my piece is supposed to be, like so, I can use that knowledge and check it other places. So, for example, how tall should this thing be? Well, let's see. From there to about there, that's about halfway. So half the width is the height of that plastic cap. So if this is my width, I'll switch colors here. If this is my width, then half of that from here to here is the height of my cap. Certainly is not. Right? So I have to use a little bit of math and a lot of comparative measurement to figure out where my cap should be. Then from there, block in everything else.
If it wouldn't have any too tall.
It might, and you have to play with it a little bit, you know. You have to go back and forth. You're absolutely right. You have to be able to go back and say, okay, well, find something else that you know. Okay, I know that this width and that height. So, okay, well, maybe that width and that height. Okay? So from here to here, these are the same. These are parallel. Right? And you just keep going through using some math. So between using comparative measurement to do your blocking in, as well as using that basic shape, then expanding that basic shape out into a three-dimensional form, you can use all of the stuff that we learned in Art 1 together to start blocking in the basic object and get a pretty good outline of it. Tomorrow we're going to talk about using contour lines. We'll talk about kind of thinking of these objects as three-dimensional objects so that we can start to shade and texture them more properly. We'll build out of all that, and that will help your artwork significantly. Cool? Any questions with this concept? Comparative measurement and or going from 2D objects into 3D forms. Cool? Good? All right.